Look at that. That's cool.
Frank Fritz was no ordinary collector, and his garage was no ordinary storage space. But what happened after his death stunned everyone, even the police. When they opened his garage, they didn't just find vintage cars. They found something else. A vehicle buried under dust and secrecy. A car that by all official records shouldn't exist. What was it doing there? Why did Frank leave behind a handwritten note hinting at something bigger? This isn't just another hidden gem. This is the moment everything changed. Because what they found inside Frank Fritz's garage is far more shocking than anyone ever imagined. The obsession that drove him. Frank Fritz didn't just collect cars, he hunted them. He chased after stories wrapped in steel and chrome, tracing the rusted edges of forgotten decades. From the moment he first stepped onto our screens with American Pickers, it was clear Frank wasn't in it for the fame. He was in it for the chase. He had a deep love for things that time left behind, and for him, nothing spoke louder than a classic car with a story. To the average viewer, Frank was the quieter one, the guy with the quick wit and encyclopedic knowledge of gas station signs and oil cans. But those who watched closely saw the real obsession. The moments his voice changed when he spotted a muscle car half buried in weeds, or the way he lingered just a little longer in someone's dusty garage if a rare model was parked inside. Frank didn't just buy these vehicles. He saw something in them worth rescuing. Over the years, his private collection grew slowly but deliberately. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. There was no showroom, no velvet ropes, just a garage tucked away in Iowa, filled with machines that felt like time capsules. A 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air with those clean lines and tail fins he always admired. A 1967 Ford Fairlane GT 390 that he bought for $7,000 and personally had restored, putting another $4,000 into getting it back on the road. The 1960 Cadillac Fleetwood, bought alongside his longtime friend Mike Wolfe, was a fully optioned piece of American luxury. But it didn't stop there. Frank wasn't afraid to invest big when it came to something special. That's how he ended up with two 1954 Nash Healey sports cars, acquired for a combined $46,000. A 1914 Mertz cycle car followed, a rare three-wheeler from another world entirely, worth around $35,000. His prized possession? A 1947 Cisitalia Nuvolari Spider. A post-war Italian masterpiece, lightweight, fast, and stunningly rare. Valued at more than $500,000, it was the crown jewel of his hidden trove. Each car came with a story, and Frank remembered every one of them. Whether it was a barn find, a long-haul tow, or a late-night online auction win, he could tell you how he got it, what it meant to him, and why it deserved a second life. These weren't investments for him. They were rescue missions. They were proof that the past still mattered. What made Frank unique was that he never let his success change the way he saw these items. He never built a flashy Instagram empire, never threw lavish open houses to show off his collection. His garage remained closed to most outsiders, a sanctuary of sorts, filled with dust, grease, and reverence. Friends would say he sometimes disappeared in there for hours, tinkering with old parts, cataloging what he had, or just sitting quietly with the cars that meant the most to him. There's something intimate about that. In a world where everything gets shared and monetized, Frank kept his most treasured finds behind locked doors. And that's where the mystery starts. Because not everything he found was ever shown on camera. Not every deal was made in the spotlight. And as time went on, Frank became more reclusive, more private, and his garage, once a symbol of his passion, became something else entirely. No one knew what was inside, not even the people closest to him. And after his death, when the locks were finally broken and the heavy doors pushed open, what they found inside changed everything. But before we get there, it's important to understand just how deep Frank's obsession ran, and why some say it was never about the money or the cars at all. It was about proving that some things are worth holding on to, no matter how many people forget they existed. A collector's final years. As Frank's presence on American pickers began to fade, so did the public's view into his world. What started as a slow withdrawal became something more permanent. By 2020, Frank had quietly exited the show, citing back surgery and personal health issues. At the time, fans assumed he'd bounce back. But the truth was, things were unraveling behind the scenes. His health wasn't just a temporary setback. It was part of a larger decline that would shadow his final years. Friends close to him said that Frank became more isolated. He stopped taking many calls, limited visits, and spent most of his time at home. But that home wasn't ordinary. It was a piece of living history. His garage, which had always been a place of restoration and purpose, turned into something quieter, more cryptic. He didn't talk much about what was inside. And even those who knew him best hadn't been inside for years. Publicly, there were glimpses. A Facebook post showing his 1939 Plymouth Coupe, with a caption that hinted at how proud he was to have it. Another post where he talked about restoring the Ford Fairlane, the way it growled when it finally ran again. But those posts stopped coming. And soon, so did the updates. As his health worsened, the garage doors stayed shut. The collection, however, had grown. Though he was no longer on the road for the show, Frank kept acquiring cars. Sometimes he sent a middleman to check out a vehicle for him. Other times, he bought sight unseen. It wasn't reckless, it was instinct. He'd been doing it for decades, and he knew exactly what to look for. Every purchase still came with intent. One of the last confirmed purchases was a vehicle most people didn't even recognize. It wasn't flashy, no chrome, no muscle. Just a strange shape, faded paint, and no clear markings. When a neighbor asked about it, Frank only said, "It's older than you think," then wheeled it into the garage and closed the door behind it. That was over a year before he passed. What made Frank different from other collectors was his philosophy. He didn't chase trends. He didn't hoard for the sake of volume. He sought meaning. And that's what made his final years so mysterious. If he kept collecting while sick, while mostly alone, what was he chasing? There were rumors. One said he had a secret list of vehicles tied to American automotive myths, one-off prototypes, race cars that disappeared, unfinished concepts. Another said he had been negotiating with a retired GM employee who claimed to have a factory car no one had seen since the 60s. Nothing confirmed, of course. Just whispers from the antique auto community. But here's what is confirmed. Before his death, Frank made several cryptic remarks to old friends. He said, "There's something in that garage that'll outlive all of us." In another conversation, he reportedly told someone, "If they ever open that garage without me, tell them I left everything behind." No one thought much of it at the time. Frank had always been poetic like that. When the end came, it wasn't loud. No grand farewell, no press release. Just silence. A man who once lit up screens across the country passed away surrounded by what he loved most. Solitude and stories waiting to be uncovered. And as the legal process began, and his property passed into the hands of estate handlers and investigators, all eyes turned to the one place that had remained untouched. His garage, locked, quiet, undisturbed. Whatever he left behind in there, it wasn't just a collection of cars. It was a record of a life spent chasing the rare, the forgotten, the unbelievable. And as the key turned and the doors creaked open for the first time in years, those closest to the case were about to see that Frank hadn't stopped chasing the impossible. He had caught it, and hidden it in plain sight. The garage nobody could touch. The day they opened Frank Fritz's garage, there was an eerie kind of silence. Not the respectful kind you hear at a memorial, but the kind that sinks in when people realize they're stepping into something untouched. Police officers stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, their hands on their belts, exchanging quiet looks. The estate attorney held the key. And behind that heavy roll-up door, years of secrets were waiting. Until that moment, the garage had remained sealed under court order. It was part of the process, inventorying personal assets, verifying ownership, protecting any valuables that might surface during probate. No one expected what came next. The garage itself wasn't large, at least not from the outside. A weathered steel frame, some ivy on the edges, and a dented side door that looked like it hadn't been opened in a decade. But the moment the main door lifted, inch by inch, dust spilled out like smoke, and so did the weight of a legacy. There were 8 vehicles parked in tight formation, some covered in old tarps, others left bare, their paint dulled by time but still striking in their form. The 1956 Bel Air stood proudly near the front, its turquoise body dulled but intact. Next to it, the 1967 Fairlane GT 390, one of Frank's prized muscle cars. The Cadillac Fleetwood, all chrome and elegance, filled the back left corner. It was a museum, frozen in time. But there was something else. A car no one recognized. Parked sideways near the back wall, under a gray tarp stained with oil, was a vehicle that didn't match anything on Frank's known roster. The shape was odd, low to the ground, aggressively curved, with an unusually wide rear. At first glance, it looked like some sort of prototype or racing shell. One of the officers approached and gently peeled back the tarp. That's when things changed. It was a Corvette, but not one anyone had seen in person before. Its lines were more aggressive than a standard Stingray. The body looked handcrafted, almost experimental. The nose dipped unusually low, and the back end was wider than it should have been. What stood out most was the absence of any proper VIN plate in the expected spots. Instead, there was a small brass tag, riveted to the firewall with faded lettering, and a strange sequence of numbers that didn't align with any GM record. The officers called it in. The attorney made a note. No one touched the vehicle beyond that, but everyone kept glancing back at it. Something didn't feel right. On the inside wall of the garage, barely visible under years of grime, was a handwritten note taped just above the workbench. The paper had yellowed, and the ink had bled in places, but the message was still readable. I left behind everything there. Frank. It didn't say what everything meant, but it felt deliberate, like a final clue, like he wanted someone to find it. Later, a local mechanic brought in to assess the vehicles would say the unknown Corvette wasn't supposed to exist, that it looked like a 1963 Grand Sport, but with inconsistencies that didn't add up. Only 5 were officially produced, all accounted for, yet here was one more, or something like it, and Frank, for reasons he never explained, had kept it buried under a tarp in the back of his private sanctuary. People started asking questions. How did he get it? Where did it come from? And why hadn't he told anyone? The garage that no one could touch had just given up its first secret. But it wouldn't be the last. Because what Frank left behind wasn't just a mystery. It was a challenge. One that would pull in experts, collectors, and skeptics alike, all trying to figure out how a man who spent his life digging through the forgotten might have uncovered something America's biggest car makers wanted to stay buried. The car that shouldn't exist. When the garage door finally groaned open and the dust began to settle, no one expected anything out of the ordinary. Frank Fritz was known to own some beautiful machines. His 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air, the 1967 Fairlane GT 390, the pair of 1954 Nash Healey sports cars, even the legendary Cisitalia Nuvolari Spider. These were known quantities, documented over the years by fans, collectors, and the occasional magazine feature. What they didn't expect was the quiet anomaly hidden beneath a worn tarp in the very back of the garage. After his death, they opened Frank Fritz's garage and found a car that shouldn't exist. Its shape was familiar but off. Fiberglass body, low profile, exaggerated fenders, clearly a Corvette, but unlike any model you'd typically find at an auction or museum. When they peeled back the tarp, the confusion only deepened. According to reports, the bodywork matched that of a 1963 Grand Sport, a race-bred Corvette so rare that only 5 were ever officially built by Chevrolet before the project was shut down. And all 5 accounted for. Yet, if the reports are true, this one was here, sitting silently among Frank's collection. No fanfare, no documentation, no explanation. There was no VIN where it should have been. Just a small brass plate, hand-stamped with cryptic numbers and the words, "Experimental use only." It looked handmade. The fiberglass seemed era-correct, The chassis, unlisted. And the more they examined it, the clearer it became. This car, by every official record, shouldn't exist. Frank had never mentioned it. Not in interviews, not in episodes, not even in passing. He'd spent decades sharing his finds with the world, but this one he'd kept for himself. Quietly, deliberately. And that's when the message taped to the wall above his workbench came into focus. In his handwriting, worn and slightly smudged with age, were the words, "I left behind everything there." At first, it read like a sentimental goodbye. But now, with this discovery, it felt more like a riddle. The car didn't just raise questions. It unsettled the room. A Corvette that didn't match any production history, a prototype body with a missing trail, and a collector known for his obsessive attention to detail? The implications were heavy. Some began speculating it could be one of the rumored lost mules, test cars built at the same time as the Grand Sports, but never officially released. Others believed it was something even stranger, a one-off, built in secret by engineers with access to the original molds, hidden for decades before somehow landing in Frank's hands. What's clear is that Frank knew what he had. He protected it, never registered it, never shared it, and positioned it in the farthest, darkest corner of his private garage. Not as a display piece, more like something tucked away, waiting. And now, after his death, it was finally uncovered. A car that shouldn't exist, quietly emerging from the shadows of a life spent chasing the rare and unbelievable. The discovery set off a chain reaction. Corvette experts and historians flooded forums. GM remained silent. Theories clashed. Some argued it was the greatest replica ever built. Others believed it could rewrite part of Corvette history. One thing they agreed on: whatever this car was, Frank had kept its secret with him to the grave. In the end, it wasn't the dollar value or the brand that made this find extraordinary. It was the impossibility of it. The fact that a man known for uncovering lost treasures had left behind one final mystery. No camera crews, no headlines, just 4 wheels, a brass tag, and a locked garage holding on to a secret that never should have made it this far. Questions that still linger. The car's discovery didn't just spark curiosity, it cracked open a vault of unanswered questions that no one, not even Frank Fritz's closest friends, seemed ready to answer. It wasn't just about what the car was. It was about why it was hidden, how it ended up in Frank's garage, and whether it was ever meant to be found at all. Shortly after the find made its way into niche automotive forums, interest grew far beyond the usual car enthusiast circles. Vintage racing communities picked it apart, photo by photo. Corvette historians tried to match it against every known prototype, mule car, and early development sketch from Chevrolet's short-lived Grand Sport program. But each answer only raised more questions. The biggest one being, was this car authentic? If it was a real, undocumented Grand Sport prototype, then Frank had managed to get his hands on a vehicle that General Motors itself didn't acknowledge. And if it wasn't authentic, if it was a replica or Frankenstein build made from original blueprints or stolen factory parts, it still begged another question. Who built it? The craftsmanship wasn't amateur. Every angle, every contour, every weld told a story. It had the fingerprints of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And then came the rumors. One source claimed Frank had quietly bought the shell and parts from a retired GM engineer in the early 2000s, years before his health began to decline. Another said he had acquired it through a back-channel deal at an estate sale in Flint, Michigan, near old GM grounds. These stories couldn't be confirmed, but they kept resurfacing. In some ways, it fit Frank's style. He was never the kind of collector who sought applause. He liked the obscure, the overlooked, the hidden. His garage was never curated like a museum. It was a workshop, a retreat. And that made it the perfect place for something like this to stay buried. But what unsettled people most wasn't just the car, it was the silence that followed. GM refused to issue a public statement. When pressed, a spokesperson simply said they had no information regarding any such vehicle. That didn't stop former engineers and mechanics from whispering that more Grand Sports may have been built than officially acknowledged. perhaps stored off the books for future testing, and quietly scattered after the program was shut down. If Frank's car was one of those, then its very existence was an accidental leak in a story that was never meant to resurface. And then there was that note again. I left behind everything there. The longer people stared at it, the more it felt like a deliberate breadcrumb. Maybe Frank knew what kind of firestorm would follow. Maybe this was his way of passing the torch, making sure the story didn't die with him. Or maybe it was just his last joke, a final nod from a man who lived for the thrill of uncovering something no one else could find. As word spread, offers began to pour in. Museums wanted it. Private collectors offered to buy it outright, even without provenance. One international bidder supposedly offered a blank check, but the estate held off. For now, the car remains untouched, in legal limbo, surrounded by experts and lawyers who still can't agree on what it is. And Frank? He never said a word about it while he was alive. That silence is what lingers. In every interview he gave, every episode he filmed, there's no mention. No hint. No accidental glance. He kept it hidden, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Whether it's a lost prototype, a factory ghost, or the best automotive hoax in history, the truth is still locked away, just like the garage was. And maybe that's how Frank wanted it. Not everything he found was meant to be explained. Some things were just meant to be found. Legacy in steel and silence. Long after the garage was cataloged and the estate proceedings began, the car remained where it had been found. Silent, untouched, and impossible to ignore. Experts came and went, each one more intrigued than the last, but no one could make a definitive call. Too many variables. Too few answers. And Frank wasn't around to fill in the blanks. That's what makes this